Why don't we get started now? We'll start by introducing ourselves. Hello, everyone. This is Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the host of Global Dispatches, this very podcast. And as you know, we're doing more and more of these episodes live via Substack. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And you can go, why don't you introduce yourself, Dahlia?
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. I forgot there's no audience, right? So I'm Dahlia Dawson Kay. I'm a senior fellow at the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations. I was the former director of the Center for Middle East Public Policy at RAND, and I've been following the Middle East and Israel and Iran for a while.
And you have a book coming out in December on
Yes.
U.S.-Iran policy. Plug that off the top.
Yes, thank you for reminding me. I have to start getting in the promotion mode. Yes, I have a new book. I think appropriately titled it's the enduring hostility is the title. It's the making of U.S. Iran policy, and it's basically looking back from the revolution and specifically the Reagan administration through Biden, including covering the first Trump administration. And kind of why we see this relationship as hostile as it is. And I think actually a lot of playing out today. We've seen in some of the past history, but it's an analytic look, and it also is aiming to look forward as well. What we can learn from this record of hostility, which is now unbelievably lasting longer than the Cold War itself.
Hmm.
Hopefully one day we will resolve it soon, but probably not this week.
Speaking about this week, just a wild turn of events in Iran, in the Middle East over the last week and a half. I want to kick off just by asking you about events over the last really few hours at this point. So we are recording this on Tuesday, June 24th. Last night, Donald Trump declared a ceasefire, that a ceasefire had been reached. It appears that prior to the ceasefire actually going into effect, Israel launched some of its heaviest bombing on Tehran. Iran responded. There was an apparent violation of the ceasefire, potentially. The details are a little unclear, and I'd love to have you explain. But this morning, on his way to the NATO summit in The Hague, the Netherlands, Donald Trump lashed out at Iran and particularly at Israel and in like expletive-laden remarks, basically telling Israel mostly to cut it out, to let the ceasefire take hold. First, I just love to have you explain just the events from the ceasefire until we're speaking now, but more broadly, get your perspective and your take on what you're looking towards that will suggest to you whether or not indeed this ceasefire holds.
Yeah, well, these events are really, as you said, happening very quickly. I think, announcing a ceasefire and actually doing the hard work of brokering one are two different things. And I think that might help explain why the start of this ceasefire this morning was very bumpy, and in fact led to the loss of life. So very serious violations right out of the gate. It does seem to be under control now, but essentially what happened is overnight, and we should preface this by reminding the listeners that over the weekend, just over the past 24 hours, the Iranians retaliated for the unprecedented U.S. strike, joining the Israelis on three nuclear sites in Iran, including the deeply buried Fordow facility. That happened overnight Friday into Saturday. And the Iranians responded with a fairly measured, contained attack that was signaled ahead of time, it seems, to contain the situation. There were no casualties. They did attack the largest U.S. base in the region, in Qatar. So this again just happened. Trump issued as all of these, it's insane that we're saying this, but most policy pronouncements these days, both for U.S. policymakers and for the rest of the world, are coming out through Trump's social media posts. So that's how we're all finding out about things in real time. And essentially, Trump said, "Fine, they got it out of their system. We don't have to do more." So I think it's very clear that both the U.S. and, of course, Iran, which is getting pounded, is eager and ready to call it a day and try to contain this. We can talk later about why I think it's not likely to just be contained. And there are many implications of the US taking this major, major step, which I think are very worrying. But for the time being, that does seem to be the case. And then following that, Trump then announces this ceasefire. Um, but it's not clear that the Iranians or the Israelis fully understood when it was supposed to start, what the terms of it were, and so you saw a very last ditch effort, some major bombing by the Israelis in Iran early in the morning. Then the Iranians launched a very severe attack with their very, still very limited missile capability left, but still able to launch devastating attacks that penetrated Israeli air defense and hit a southern town in Beersheba, killed 4 Israelis. That just happened today. It's all happening so quickly. And then the Israelis claim that the Iranians then violated. The Iranians say that happened before the ceasefire went into effect. It's very murky about when it did. Then the Israelis claim that the Iranians violated the ceasefire with a missile attack in the north that didn't hit anything. It didn't kill anyone. But Israel immediately said, its defense minister to issue a statement saying, we're going to retaliate with devastating attacks, not just, including, he used the word regime targets. So it looked like a very major Israeli attack was underway that would scuttle the whole ceasefire. Then, as you just referred, there was this very, how do we put it? Language I don't use myself.
I use it
Statement
all the
by the
time.
president.
I wasn't
Okay,
shocked.
well, yeah. So
I do
sometimes,
appreciate,
but
frankly,
I
this
don't.
the strategic, use of the F-bomb here, I think is actually, kind of
Right.
a genius.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, it seemed to work in the sense that there are reports that then Israel scaled back its retaliation, although it didn't call it off. So Israel did violate the ceasefire, went ahead and retaliated with another attack within Iran, but apparently scaled back. So, needless to say, this all suggests a few questions. One is, how sustainable will this ceasefire be? And I think it's already clear from the start it's going to be very fragile. Lots of red lines were crossed over the last, since June 13th and even before, really, when it comes to Israel-Iran conflict. But it's clear, well, it's not completely clear what's left of the Iranian program, but some of the fundamentals are still in place. And so we have to ask ourselves, with Israel's penetration within Iran, likely continue assets in the country, the stakes are high. They feel they have the upper hand. They still dominate the airspace. One argument is they can cut their losses. And now with the Trump pressure, it seems that they'll call it the day for now, but it's not clear that this story is over. It's also not clear what Trump will do if Israel continues to violate the ceasefire. So he can still say, use the F-bomb. He can still say these very, very, very strong statements, which he did. But, will he back it up with actual actions like threatening arms sales or, things that people talked about with when Biden was president, what he should be doing to rein the Israelis in? It's not clear that Trump would go that far. But he was quite explicit, and so for now, it seems to be sort of containing the situation. But it's very fragile, and I think the big question, is will the Israelis stop? And then also, I don't think it's over for Iran either. You don't just hit 3 nuclear sites inside their country, unprecedented attack, a massive Israeli assault on their military, their capabilities, the penetration of their intelligence. Most likely, Iran is going to regroup internally, try to figure out where these leaks have been. But the bottom line is, I don't think this is over. The very, very dangerous escalation that we were worried about over the last day seems to be more or less contained. But things can flip instantly if there's a miscalculation or there's an attack that's misunderstood that leads to massive death, will force a counter retaliation. So it's very, very, very tenuous situation.
I wanted to probe 2 things you just referenced. The first is Israel's kind of strategic decision making at this point. I mean, it seems to me that Israel probably would have preferred not to have a ceasefire, that they very firmly had the upper hand. and would have continued to try to degrade Iran's military capability and its regime as much as possible. And so, really, it seems like this is. I'd love to have you respond to this idea, but it seems like the ball is kind of in Israel's court right now. Do they like succumb to Trump administration pressure, or do they kind of go it alone?
Yeah, or they take a middle ground, which they say, yes, we're adhering to the ceasefire, but in practice, as attention starts turning away, they continue to strike. We saw this in the Hezbollah Lebanon context, where there's supposedly a ceasefire that's been in place since November, but you see continuous Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon. They basically have a free hand. So I think the fact that Israel, and this was a huge success of their operation, which is they completely demolished Iranian air defense. So they have free reign over Iranian airspace. This is why they will be very tempted to keep going back because, whatever Trump says about total victory and demolishing, it's pretty clear that hasn't been done. So the Israelis are going to have a strong temptation to keep going back. And if Trump gets distracted with other things, they may kind of test the limits there. So I think Israel is going to be the player to watch. I think, Iran is in a very weakened state right now, is more reason to want to get out of this for the moment. It may buy their time and find other ways to retaliate. We may not have seen the end of it yet. So I think the Israeli calculation is the one to look to. And the issue there is that we still don't have a very clear understanding of what their end game is, right? Because look at their target list since June 13th when they started this. Yes, it hit nuclear sites. And yes, they were asking the United States to come in to help them attack the very deeply buried nuclear site at Fordow that their own military capabilities could do without US B-2 bombers. But um, the sites also included electricity, Iranian television. Just today or yesterday, everything's moving so fast. They just attacked Evin Prison, which is a very notorious, horrible prison that is known for particularly holding dual nationals, political prisoners, very repressive place. And the idea, I think, of the Israeli government there is to try to show the Iranian people, we're with you. Netanyahu, during this campaign, has already said, we hope the Iranian people rise up. So all of these messages, the targeting, the rhetoric, is also leading to very murky messaging in terms of, is it Israel's aim just the nuclear, or is it to try maybe not regime change, because that's not really likely or possible from historical examples from the air without a ground campaign to topple a regime, but to lead to chaos in the country where there could be some regime collapse or disorientation. And a lot of what they were doing seemed aimed that way, including up to the very moment of this ceasefire, so-called ceasefire. We'll see. We'll see how it holds. So again, I think this is a very, very dangerous moment. It doesn't seem that Trump signed up for regime change, although he did issue one bizarre tweet that suggested that was the case, and also some other post about Iranian surrender and so forth.
Yeah.
So it's, but at the moment, it seems he probably got a lot of phone calls from, the restrainer kind of camped within the Republican circles and advisors suggesting, come on, let's not get entangled. You didn't campaign on this. So for the time being, it doesn't look like the U.S. is aiming for regime change, but let's face it fully backed the Israeli war. And is the Israeli war joined the war, and the war aims do suggest, if not in formal statements, but in terms of target list and rhetoric, a regime collapse or regime instability aspirations.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is definitely tricky in terms
So
of where this is headed.
a second theme that you've hit on a couple of times now, and I'll quote back to you, is like the worrying implications of U.S. actions. Now, I don't like watch a lot of cable news, but I was watching last night, and it seems that like the emerging conventional wisdom is that these American actions were a success. That while they might not have gotten all of the highly enriched uranium in Iran, that's closer to nuclear weapons grade, they nonetheless severely degraded and delayed Iran's ability to turn that highly enriched uranium, which might be hiding somewhere in the country, into a bomb. And for that reason, this was a success. Um, but you keep sort of referencing how Iran might respond. So what are you looking towards in terms of what Iran's response might be? We did see, that sort of seemingly de-escalatory attack on the largest American base in the region, which was telegraphed ahead of time, which caused no damage. What are those worrying implications that you've kind of referenced a couple times?
Yeah. Well, one was what we saw happen, which is an Iranian attack on U.S. forces in the region. We still have despite all the talk of pivoting to Asia, we still have tens of thousands of U.S. military personnel stationed in the region. So that's one worry that happened. It was thankfully contained, and it looked like the Iranians did not want to kill Americans, which would have forced Trump to have to respond. So that's good news. But it doesn't mean that's over. There are a number of militia forces in Iraq. They don't always take direct orders from Tehran. There could be some angry people who decide to take some of their own actions. You continue to have the Houthis in Yemen who tend to be a bit renegade and could continue to. They've already said that the ceasefire with the U.S. is over. They could hit U.S. targets in the Gulf. You also have more extreme measures like closing the Strait of Hormuz has been talked about, but that would, of course, hurt Iran itself just as much. Is not that simple. So I don't think those are as likely. But over time, and I think here it's less the immediate, and this is the key takeaway, is a lot of these concerns are not about today and tomorrow. So yes, it was an impressive tactical military maneuver. There's no question about it. What the Israelis did and what the Americans did. We have a lot of advanced weaponry, right? The U.S. and Israel Iran is no match for what we have. Um, that that's been cleared. That's not a news flash. We have a tremendous capability, and we used it, and it was effective in that sense. But the problem is always, what is the strategic objective? What is the ending? What are we trying to lead to? And this is the biggest worry beyond the retaliation, which, by the way, is not just a question of what's going to happen tomorrow, the next day, but also as we saw after the Soleimani strike in 2020, when Trump in the first administration decided to assassinate the IRGC commander. We saw they responded in kind of a similar contained way, although there were injuries, serious injuries at the U.S. base they attacked in Iraq. But it was only in the aftermath that you saw assassination plots unfold. Even, there's an indictment against Iran that they even tried to assassinate President Trump during the campaign, and target individuals who were associated with the Soleimani strike and maximum pressure and so forth. So the Iranians, they can play a long game. And so we need to be careful. But the biggest worry that I have, and this is why I think that the ceasefire and the underlying trigger to this conflict, is that this strike really hurt on two levels, hurt the nonproliferation effort and hurt diplomacy. And we know from the historical record that diplomacy and diplomatic agreements are far superior to containing nuclear programs than military force. And so the biggest concern is we did this, big, impressive military maneuver, but what did we gain by it? And right now, the estimates, and again, we should be measured and have some humility because we don't have full facts yet. But from the initial assessment, it does not look like it's demolished. There's a lot of talk about 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that is somewhere in the country. We now have far less IAEA access. The Iranians are already talking in parliament about cutting off inspector access to the country. There could be secret facilities. They could be rushing. If you were the Iranians, you might be more incentivized to rush and move toward weaponizing the current civilian nuclear capabilities as a deterrent, because clearly their previous deterrence and defense failed. So what it does when you attack this is we lost visibility, which means we could be setting the path where in 2 or 3 years, or possibly sooner, some nuclear nonproliferation specialists are now saying maybe this attack bought us a year, maybe 2 years. It depends, but nothing like what the nuclear Iran deal that Trump left in 2018 gave us, which was, it wasn't perfect, obviously, but it bought 10, 15. Some of the elements were good for 25 years, some were indefinite. That's a lot longer than what a military strike just got us. So that's one problem. And the other big problem is,
Can I just stop you there
yeah,
just to
yeah,
emphasize that point, because again, it's like lost in like most mainstream discourse, is that you know Iran was nuclear weapons program was contained, and by exiting the Iran nuclear deal, ultimately Trump set into motion this strike over the weekend, which very well might have been a tactical success, but strategically in the long run may inspire Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, which by all accounts it was like a near nuclear weapons power and was hovering at that near nuclear weapons power status. Now it sees the value in actually acquiring a nuclear weapon to
yeah,
deter an attack like this
yeah,
in the future.
yeah. That's the tragedy of this, is that this may lead to completely the counter, the exact opposite result that we would like to achieve here,
Mhm.
because I'm definitely in the camp that does not want to see a nuclear armed Iran. The nuclear deal, and I don't want to rehash it, but just because we're talking percentage levels, 90% is weaponization level. Iran got up to 60% because once Trump left the deal, they continued to increase, starting at the end of Biden, and starting the end of Trump into Biden, and they got dangerously close. They became a threshold state essentially, but there was no evidence that they were weaponizing at the moment, or some imminent threat that should suggested that would trigger this kind of response. During the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, Iran's enrichment was capped at 3.67. I mean, and the stockpiles were considerably lower. So, yes, there were sunsets, and some would sunset this year. Like, I don't want to get into the technical
Yeah.
again, go through that the whole thing. But that diplomatic deal right now is looking pretty good considering what military options are giving us. And this was the debate 10 years ago, or over 10 years ago, about why military options were not the best way to deal with the Iran nuclear threat. And now we're in this situation where we have very little visibility into what they're doing. And so that is, I think, one of the hugest implications of this attack that's really going to come back to bite us, and not just us, the entire international community. The Europeans have been backing this attack as well. It shocks me, because given
Yeah.
that they have just as big of a stake in nonproliferation regime as we do. So that's a huge concern. And then the other, and it's tied to that, is that this really blew up diplomacy. I mean, there's talk about, okay, we'll pressure them now to go back to it. What kind of a deal? What kind of a deal are we talking about now?
Mhm.
What nuclear deal is even in the realm of reality after this kind of devastating war that we just witnessed? What
Mhm.
Trump is calling the 12th day war. We'll see how many days. But yeah. So I'm extremely worried, given that I do believe diplomacy would have been the better way. There looked like there had been attempts to get there before this started. Trump seemed interested. Again, I'm not completely sure that was going as well as advertised. I think there was a lot of wishful thinking about Trump and what he was willing to concede realistically that would have gotten us over the finish line for a nuclear agreement, a new one. Um, but it certainly was worth a try. And now I see no reason for the Iranians to return to the negotiating table. They may return for a little bit. We may have negotiations over ceasefire terms and containing the conflict, but getting them to do things like dismantle completely any domestic enrichment, they're going to have more incentive. If they
Mhm.
stay in the NPT, they have a right to enrichment. They're going to have more incentive to do that. So I do not see this as a big win. I see a lot of dangers ahead. And I think that this set of events over the past 2 weeks the Middle East is already set back with the horrendous war in Gaza. This is just more instability. And I think the fact that most of the neighborhood was against this, as much as they dislike Iran, and there is not a lot of sympathy for Iran in the region. They have a lot of enemies. Nobody liked this idea because it opens up a can of worms. It opens up uncertainty. It opens up the potential for more instability. This is hard. Instability is bad for business, is bad for development. That's what a lot of these countries are trying to focus on. So, for all sorts of reasons, this was really a crazy and I think unfortunate set of developments, despite the impressive tactical gains the Israelis may think they have made, and they
Yeah.
did make some.
I mean, like the way I see it, just as, obviously more of a passive observer than you, is that really from Iran's perspective or what we might expect from Iran, there are kind of two ways this could go. You articulated earlier some of the more asymmetric options Iran has to retaliate against the United States. Everything from assassination attacks or assassination attempts to terrorist attacks against American forces in the region, maybe American citizens or American targets abroad. They certainly have demonstrated that that's something that they are willing to do in the past. However, on the other hand, it seems that Iran has been so weakened and degraded by Israelis' assault, wiping out their entire upper echelon of military forces. And, the Ayatollah seems to be like a doddering 86-year-old at this point, that maybe indeed Iran is just too weak to respond.
Yeah, no, they're incredibly weak, and not just because of this last a cycle of conflict, but really going back, and this is why this conflict can't be dislinked, it can't be disassociated from the Gaza war, because October 7th was a very transformative event in terms of Israeli strategic thinking, in terms of the focus on Iran and the proxies. And so we saw it did happen overnight. First, it was a war on Hamas, but really transformative changes in terms of direct Israeli-Iranian conflict, crossing new red lines starting last in April of 24, October of 24, direct clashes. These were things the Iranians never wanted. Their whole idea, and both Israel and Iran, their doctrines before October 7th and long-standing positions were you keep war off of your territory, right? Both of these countries have had bad experiences with being attacked on their territories. The Iranians lived through missile attacks of the Iraqis in their long war in the 1980s. Israelis were surprised in 1973. They both had they faced Hezbollah missiles. So the idea is keep attacks off your territory. Don't fight directly. Give an exit ramp to the other side to keep things contained. Keep punching the other side. They're not on friendly terms, but there were kind of rules of engagement. Most of those rules kind of blew up after October 7th. Israel's risk tolerance increased, and they once they were they were on the back foot at first. Obviously, this was a devastating surprise attack against Israel on October 7th. But then once they regrouped, they obviously had their sights set on the entire proxy network and really went after them very, very seriously. And where we saw the biggest breakthrough was when they really dismantled and went after Hezbollah in the late
Mhm.
summer of
Yeah, that
last
seemed to
year.
be a test run
And
from what
that
we
is,
saw.
it
That was
was
like a
a
test
test
run.
run.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah,
similar
test run,
tactics. Yeah.
but similar tactics and also preparation, because one of the two main factors that had restrained Israel in the past, and Israeli leadership had been thinking about a military attack on Iran. This is not new. This is something that was, I remember in the 2011-12 period, there were front page stories, Atlantic, New York Times, everywhere, Israeli papers. When is Israel going to attack? They've been thinking about this for a very long time, and it was serious. It wasn't just, rhetoric. And there were plans in place to do it. Two main factors restrain them. One is worrying about the U.S. response, because the U.S. was never eager to get in. They didn't want to get dragged in. This was the worry about what Trump did. And two, they were worried about the deterrent force, because Iran's way of keeping war off its territory was this, so-called forward defense, building up these proxy networks where those forces like Hezbollah and Hamas, they would hit Israel. Iran would supply them with training and weapons, but the return address would not be Iran. They would take the hits, not Iran. That no longer applied after
Yeah.
October 7th. And even before that, Israeli thinkers were already talking about let's hit the head of the octopus, not just the tentacles, et cetera, et cetera. But now Israel actually did it. And so by really demolishing Hezbollah, the biggest worry for Israel in the past was that they would be subject to, tens of thousands of missiles from Lebanon, which would devastate the country. These were very serious missiles. And Israel took that card off the table. And so
Mhm.
that cleared the way. It also cleared the way for air superiority. And then the final nail in the coffin in terms of, events that I think increased the incentives for the Israelis to move in this direction, was the fall of the Assad regime, right? So you have the collapse in Syria of one of the only state ally of Iran. Iran is a very lonely country, not many allies, and so this kind of paved the way. And reports suggest the Israelis really did do the serious planning toward what they did on June 13th, starting last December. And so this is why the Iranians are quite weak. And so there is an argument that therefore we don't need to worry about them. And this is the incentive for Israel to say, let's continue to hit them hard while they're on the back foot, reshape the Middle East, things like that. The problem is weak actors can also be very dangerous. And this campaign, at least this moment of this campaign, ended, and a lot of leaders are still in place and can be replaced. And what we've seen also from historical examples is that many times when you replace leaders you think are really horrible, and they are, you get even worse ones, right? So we saw this after the PLO, and then we got worse, in terms of Israel. So again, you got rid of Saddam Hussein, then we got ISIS in Iraq. These things can evolve in ways that we can't predict right now sitting in this conversation. But you're really stirring the pot. And when you stir the pot in the Middle East, uh, more often than not, uh, uh, the consequences are dangerous. So that is the worry. Not that right now Israel can't continue to hit Iran hard. They can, and the U.S. can continue backing them. But to what end? What are we trying to accomplish? And so I think that's kind of where we're where we are right now.
Well, Dahlia, thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to reading your book when it comes out in December. Thank you all for watching the live stream and for listening and for watching the emailed version of this. If you appreciate this kind of content, I really would appreciate your support. Please do consider becoming a paid subscriber to Global Dispatches. It helps me bring you content like this on the regular. So thank you. Thank you so much, Dahlia, and thank you all
Thank you,
for
Mark.
watching and listening.
Yep. Thanks so
Bye.
much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.